Okay, so in this project, we're going to be building a mini image gallery, which is going to read images from a directory and then display them on the page. Now, as you can see at the moment, we have an error, could not load images, and this is because we're going to be adding in some error handling, either if the directory here that we specified doesn't exist, or if there are no images inside. Now, because I am on a Mac, you can also see I have this .dsstore hidden file. We're also going to be protecting against that as well, so we don't load anything in that we don't want. So what I'm going to do is just drag over a few images to this folder. I'm going to come over to the browser and give that a refresh, and you can see here that that's loaded and displayed all of them images from that directory. So this is what we're going to be building. We're not going to make it look pretty, but we are going to be, of course, covering everything in the back end. So let's go ahead and build this out. Okay, so just starting out with a completely fresh PHP file, of course, we're going to go ahead and first of all take a look at how we read things from a directory. What we're then going to be doing is taking that functionality and putting it into a function which will allow us to use it anywhere else if we need to. So the basics of reading from a folder then is using a function called read dir, which stands for read directory. Now, obviously you can read more about this on the PHP manual, but what we're going to do here is just implement it, and I'll let you go ahead and look at the specifics if you need to. So the way that we actually do this then, and I guess before we even start, we probably need a directory to actually work with. So why don't we just create an images directory just here, and what I'm going to do is just pull over them few files, just so I have a few files that I can work with. There we are. Now these are in the course downloads if you want to go ahead and use these if you don't have any images that you can play around with. Okay, so now that we have our directory, and now that we have files within that directory, we need to go ahead and read all of the files from a directory. Now, the first thing that we would do is go ahead and open this. So we would say something like directory equals, and then go ahead and use open dir. So open directory, and then we just give the directory name. So in this case, it's images. So let's do a var dump on this again, just to see what we're working with here, and we'll come over to the browser and give that a refresh. So at the moment we have something called a resource. Now, I mentioned earlier when we were looking at different data types that we have things like strings, integers, floats, arrays, objects, and we also have resources. So at the moment, this is a stream. So basically, this will contain all of the information about this directory, but it won't be in a traditional sense like in an array. It will be something that we can go ahead and maybe iterate over or extract information out from. Because it's a little bit more complex, because this is now representing a directory, it's a little bit more complicated than just an array. So now, to list through all of the images, or just generally the files in a directory, we need to do this in a while loop. So if we just go ahead and define out our while loop, we looked at these earlier, but this is slightly different now. What we need to do is place the assignment of reading this directory inside of a loop. What that will in turn do is it will pull out each of the files, and we do this in a while loop, so we know that we're looping through potentially all of the files. So this is a little bit different to what we're used to, but still this is just the way it works. So let's go ahead and assign within this while loop read dir, which is a function I mentioned earlier, and here what we're going to do is pull in this resource to read everything from here. So what this essentially will do is it will loop while we have no new files that we need to loop through. So essentially we're just looping through all files, and we do that in a while loop because then in here we can do whatever we want with each of them files. So now, what is this image file just here? Well, we can do a var dump on that and check it out. So let's go ahead and put that in there and go ahead and see what we've got. So let's give that a refresh. And now we have a bunch of strings. So you can see here, the first one is a dot. The second one is 2 dots. The third one here is a string dsstore. And then finally, we have the files that we actually want. So what we need to do in some way is exclude a list of files that we don't want to treat as images that we want to display within our small gallery. So we need to figure out some way later on of doing that. So I think that's just about it. Now that we know how to open a directory and go ahead and list through all the files in a while loop, because we know that a while loop will run until this condition here is false. In this case, while we're reading through, eventually we'll get to the end of the file set, this won't run anymore. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so to do this, we're going to use a function. So we're going to build a function in a completely separate file, and we're going to pull this in just so we can use it elsewhere. So let's go ahead and give this a name of directory reader, because it could be used for any other files. It doesn't have to be images. And let's start to define this function out, and then we'll go ahead and pull this all together. So obviously the function is called directory reader, and then we have a list of parameters or arguments that we can give this. So first of all, let's think about what we might need to pass through to this function. Well, we need to know the directory that we actually want to open. That's really important. And then maybe we have an array of excluded files. So we can actually map this out now. And the reason that we're doing this within the arguments is so that whenever we use this, we can change which files we want to exclude. So let's say that this needs to be an array, and we're going to say exclude files, and we're going to give this a default value. We've already learned about this, of a list of the files that we want to exclude. And this basically means, as I said, we can override this if we want when we call or invoke this function. So the last one that we want to exclude is .ds store. You may not need to do this depending on which operating system you're using, but you probably will need to exclude the dot and the dot. Just in case you were wondering as well, this dot means the current directory and this means back a directory. So that's why they are in there. Okay, so now that we have that in there, we need to basically return a list of images. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize a images variable, and I'm going to assign this an empty array. What we're then going to do down here is loop through the files. We're going to do some checks. So there are a couple of checks that we need to do, and then we need to add to the images array. And then we know that within a function, we can return the images. So that's pretty much what we're doing here. And it's always helpful to go ahead and just comment out exactly what you want to do. I find this always helps me just think about the steps I need to take. So let's try to include this from this file. We'll start to use it, and we'll see a couple of problems along the way if the directory doesn't exist that we want to use and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's require this in, or we can do a require once or an include. In this case, it really doesn't matter too much. So directory reader.php, and let's go ahead and call this. So directory reader, and we're going to say open an images directory. So we want to assign this a variable, because remember, we're going to return a list of images. So we'll do that now. And let's go ahead and check this out. So let's give that a refresh, and you can see nothing's happening. Obviously nothing's happening because in here, we're not really doing anything at the moment. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, the first check within this function, is checking if a directory exists that we specify in here. So we have that here. We want to now check that. Now to do this, we're going to use a function called isDir, so isDirectory, and we're going to pass that directory into there. Now I'm using not because I want to say, well, if this is not a directory, then from this function, I want to return null. So now what we can do is in here somewhere, check if this returns null, and we can display an error. So let's just try this out. So I'm going to say if not images, and I'm going to kill the page. We already saw an example of this, and we'll just say could not load images or could not load files. That makes sense because we're trying to keep this kind of generic to images and any other files that we want to read. So in this case then, we are passing images in. We're checking if that's a directory. In our case it is, so we shouldn't see this error. Let's go over to the browser, and it looks like we couldn't actually load files. So let's just have a look at what's going on here. And it looks like because we're not returning anything here, let's just return true down here so we can check this out. Okay, so this disappears, and the reason we're doing this is just temporarily until we actually get some images in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change this over to, say, cat. Now, this directory does not exist, so we should see could not load files. Brilliant. Okay, so now what we want to do is think about the next check here. Well, we used the opendir function a moment ago, but sometimes this is going to fail. So what we want to do in this case is use an if statement, but at the same time, inside of this if statement, we want to assign the result of that opendir function to a variable. So we're doing a check at the same time as assigning. So let's parenthesize this just so it's a little bit easier to see what we're doing. And inside of here, we're going to say images, or we could call this files directory. And we're going to assign this the result of open_dir passing in that directory like so. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to call this files. The reason I'm doing this is I want to keep this incredibly generic. So, you know, we don't just want to open images. Either way, what's going to happen here is I'm now going to check if this or the result of this was false, and we're going to return null if there was a problem opening that directory. So regardless of whether the directory exists, it will go ahead and also check if we couldn't open the directory. And we can also make this work by getting rid of the check here, because what's going to happen is we're going to not find this when we try and open it here, and then we're going to return null anyway. So when I refresh, we get the same problem here, we get the same error. However, we also get a warning, and that's exactly why we had this check in here, because the first thing we want to do is check if that directory exists. Okay, so now what we want to do is loop through all of the files. Once again, we've already seen this. We saw a little demo of this a minute ago. We're going to use a while loop in here. And what we're going to do is we are going to, again in parentheses, so it's a little bit easier to see. For each loop, we're going to say something like file equals read dir, and we're going to pass in that files directory variable like that, just like we did before. However, what we're going to do outside of the parentheses is check that it doesn't equal false, because otherwise we will come across any problems. So now, inside of here, we can do a var dump on file just to make sure we've got the same thing as we had before. And you can see that if we do go ahead and change over this to our images directory, where we know we do have files, we see the following. So we've got all of these in here. Don't worry about the little error here. That's just because we are not returning anything from the function. Remember, if we don't return anything from a function, we return void. And of course, if we are returning void, this check will be truthy and we'll go ahead and kill the page. So don't worry about that too much for now. Okay, so now inside of this loop, remember we can use things like continue and break. Well, ideally what we want to do is we want to check if each of these files within the loop matches any of the excluded files that we've given. Now, if they do match an excluded file, we want to continue the loop. We want to completely ignore the files. And the reason that we're doing that is because down here, what we're going to be doing is appending on to this files array. So what we would do here, and we'll just do it for now, and then we'll add the check in. We're going to take the directory, we're going to append on or concatenate on a /, and then we're going to concatenate on the name of the file. So if we just go and down here return the files, let's take a look at what this gives us. So down here, I'm going to do a var dump on images, and let's take a look. So we should just see an array of images /dot, which is useless, images /dot, which is also useless. Same for this one here, but now we have 3 useful paths that we can use to display the messages. Our goal now is to get rid of these here, which we've already defined as default values just over here. So let's put this check in here, and remember we want to continue the loop if this file matches one of these. Now this is pretty difficult because we've got an array here. So how are we going to check if this file is in this array? Well, you'll be pleased to know there's an inArray function. So this takes 2 arguments. The first argument is what you're looking for, and the second argument is what you're looking in. So the first argument would be a string or an array, but in our case it's a string, and the second argument is the array. So let's do a check in here, and we know that if this is in the array, we want to continue. So we're going to say in array, first argument, the file or the string or array we're looking for. In this case, it's just a string. Then we're looking inside of that exclude files thing that's been passed in there. And then if that's the case, we want to continue the loop on to the next one. We will then subsequently check the next one. And then only if we don't continue will we add that to the files array. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, have a really good look at the code. I know sometimes these things can be a little bit confusing. So now we end up with the following. Perfect. So we've excluded a list of things we don't want, and we've ended up with an array of things that we do want. Okay, so now time to do a little bit of tidying up. We've pretty much looped through the files. We've done the checks that we need. We've added it to images, or we renamed it to files. Now we have returned the images or returned the files. And now all we need to do here is close the directory. Now this isn't necessary, but it's good practice to do so. So I'm just going to close the files directory. And that is our function complete. A very useful function that we can now include on any file and go ahead and just use it, passing in what we want to use. Okay, so now that we have this then, we're going to end our PHP tag just there. We're once again going to create this document layout, so just a simple HTML layout, and we're going to go ahead and change the title over to gallery. Now what we need to do within this template is loop through each of these items in this array, so we can do that within HTML, and then from that we can create an image tag, and then using that new file path that we have for each of our images, we can go ahead and display it. So to do this within HTML, again, like we did with Echo earlier, we just use an opening and a closing PHP tag, and then we just use a normal for each loop. Now this looks a little bit different. We've got a colon just after here, and what we also do is when we end our loop, because remember, normally when we have a for each loop, it looks like this. Now what it looks like when we use it in a template is we use the end for each keyword and we end that with a semicolon. So it looks a little bit different, but it will work in exactly the same way. Okay, so we know what we want to loop over. We know how to use the for each loop. So let's go ahead and finish this off. So we're going to say for each images as image, and inside of here, again, we just want to output something. In this case, it's an image tag. We'll get rid of the alt tag because we're just kind of focusing on making this work. But in here, what we can now do is again, open and close a PHP tag. And in here, we want to echo out image, which remember is that path to the image. And remember, it's a path because we went ahead and added the directory we're loading from, a / and then the name of the file. Okay, so now that's done, let's head over to the browser and we should see a list of them 3 images. So there we go. This one was a little bit more complex and a little bit more to do here, but hopefully all of that made sense. And if not, have a really good look at the code, play around with it, change things, and these kind of things will start to make sense.